Hey there hunters, welcome back to the Gunner's Guild. Today we're here in the lands between and we're going to be discussing the bow playstyle, like a bow specific build here. We're going to cover where you get everything you need for the setup, some things to note, some mechanics you need to pay attention to, and stuff like that. So, let's just dive into this. I will preface this by saying that I'm not going to be covering or talking much about pairing like spells and incantations with bow or using melee weapons for backup, stuff like that. This is strictly bow and crossbow playstyle. And once you incorporate spells and melee weapons into it, well, you're not a bow build anymore. But, I'll make the references where applicable. Also, yes, this is going to contain spoilers, so of course, you probably don't want to be looking into this if that's the case. But yeah, let's just go ahead and get started with a general overview of the pros and cons of a ranged bow build if you're interested in it. Obviously, this is going to be more of a style choice than anything else and kind of like a challenge run thing, because bows don't really provide much in the way of pros that other builds also wouldn't be able to accommodate. Bows don't scale extremely well, and their AR is pretty low. They can't have any other affinities besides normal, and they can only use bow ashes of war, which there's only 2 of them that are any good anyway, which is barrage and rain of arrows. And of course, they're limited on ammo. So not only do you have a limited stock of ammo that you can carry and craft, but also a limited amount of shots you'd have in a boss encounter before you need to ammo swap mid-fight or something, which isn't very fun. So in the later difficulties like New Game Plus 7, where bosses have a ton of life, it doesn't really feel very good to play strictly bows with their limited ammunition. Speaking of bosses though, humanoid enemies and bosses have infinite stamina and will dodge like 95% of your arrows that you throw at them. So those are a huge pain in the ass for bow builds, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Overall though, it's kind of a lot of cons. Like, yeah, sure, you get ranged out of it, but it's not like faith and intelligence builds don't have range options either. And really, the only pro is that you can clear areas and deal with like non-boss enemies and even like elite enemies pretty easily with bows, since you can just snipe them from afar and play safe. And that's pretty much all you get out of a bow playstyle. Also, actually, side note, it does allow you to play stealthy at times, which is pretty fun in my opinion, and I don't think very many other builds can pull that off. Alright, if you still want to run a bow playthrough, let's talk about the gear and kind of what you need to collect. Now, I'm going to start with the pre-DLC gear. And do note that I have a video that I made like way back at launch showing where to get like all this early game bow equipment. So check that out in the description down below for what you're looking for. I'm going to try and piece in some information and overlay like where you can get stuff and what they do here on screen. But you probably just want to look up this stuff ahead of time. I just want to explain why we're getting this stuff and kind of where to get it real quick. Alright, so I'm not going to cover all the movesets of bows. They're pretty self-explanatory. You aim and shoot, you'll figure it out. But let's go ahead and cover the differences between the bow classes so I can explain what bows we're going to want to be using. The first major note that I mentioned before is that unlike most other weapons, bows can't change their affinities. So even if they can change their ashes of war, you can't actually make a bow sharp or quality, occult, bleeding, any of that stuff. You only get normal affinity. They also have a very limited pool of ashes of war and can't use anything that's not specifically for bow. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the bows themselves. Starting with light bows. The main differences between a light bow and a normal bow is that light bows in general are weaker than regular bows. They scale less, they just a little bit less damage per shot, and they have less range. But to make up for that, light bows can fire arrows after sprinting, backstepping, rolling, dodging, and jump shotting. This makes them far more ideal than a regular bow as their moveset is more fluid and most importantly will allow you to get 2 shots in quick succession from a jump shot and a follow-up shot. Jump shotting a bow is actually faster than the normal draw animations if you just keep firing them. However, in the latest DLC patch, they did speed that up, so it's not as significant as it was before. But you should still prioritize jump shotting with the bow where possible, because you still get to move while you're jumping. And because light bows get to follow up, they can just shoot a lot more. Of all the non-DLC short bows, none of them are particularly special and don't have significant differences between them. You can start with the short bow, find a misbegotten bow, or just buy the composite bow from the nomadic merchant to start your playthrough if you wish. Barrage should be your ashes of war of choice as it only comes on light bows and it's the most DPS a bow can actually dish out, and the safest to use. Mighty Shot, Sky Shot, and Enchanted Shot are not particularly good in my opinion, though Rain of Arrows is better in the recent patches and can be used to snipe groups of enemies from afar. It's pretty solid, but I would stick with Barrage. Now for the regular bows, or I call them just long bows, like the short bows, we only have a few to choose from and they're not significantly different from each other. Horn bow and Erdtree bow have split damage types, which are pretty bad because in general they're going to be doing less damage than standard longbows. Pulley bow has 10% more range than the other longbows, but you're probably never going to notice that with the range talisman on anyway. Serpent Bow does give you additional poison buildup, just a little bit, but it is stuck with the Mighty Shot Ashes of War, so it's not particularly good for status application anyway, when you can just throw out 2 arrows really quick with Barrage. The real only choice you have for a longbow, besides the standard longbow you get at the beginning of the game, is the black bow. Because in general, longbows are stronger than short bows and have more effective range, but they lack the follow-up shot that short bows have. But the black bow has the moveset of a short bow, allowing it to have the full range of shots while retaining the range and damage of a longbow, and having access to Barrage as its Ash of War, which no other longbow has. Being a somber weapon, it can't change its affinity or ash anyways, so it's good that it's got the best stuff out of the box. The black bow is found in Lindell, which is a bit of the ways into the campaign, so you can just use a short bow in the meantime, or a long bow for sniping until you get a great bow. And speaking of, we have the GreatBows. While GreatBows are significantly slower to use by comparison, offering no mobility, long recovery animations, and even more limited ammo, GreatBows are still outstanding at sniping enemies and clearing out areas without alerting anybody, making them very safe to progress through areas with. GreatBows are easily the best weapon for this purpose, as you don't have to spend FP or engage in enemies. You can just plow through most zones without the risk of death. Even giant enemies will get staggered and killed by GreatBows pretty easily. While there are a few options for GreatBows, you really only have 2 actual choices. You're going to want the standard GreatBow, which can be easily farmed from the Redmane Knights, the Lindell Knights, or just get it in a chest at a lookout tower. This is the only GreatBow that can actually change its Ashes of War, and it allows you to put Rain of Arrows on it, which is very strong when paired with GreatBows. The other option would be to just get General Radahn's GreatBow from his boss soul. This is a stronger GreatBow, although at the cost of a little bit more weight, but it also has its own Ashes of War that's basically Rain of Arrows, but better when paired with Radahn's Spears, which is his accompanying ammo. This ammo can also be purchased infinitely, making it a great sustainable great arrow. I love Radahn's GreatBow personally, but standard GreatBow is easier to obtain early on if you want it. So if you're planning on doing like a bow build for base game as well as DLC, I do recommend getting the black bow and a GreatBow before you at least enter the DLC. Honestly, a composite bow will do you just fine. Now inside the DLC, we have some pretty sweet new bows to collect. The first of which is the short bow called the Bone Bow, which can be obtained very early on in the Insys Castle, really early on where the Dancing Lion is. This bow is a short bow, so lower range and damage, but it has a unique Ashes of War called Raincore Shot. This is basically the same as Enchanted Shot and Barrage both together. It's a rapid firing arrow barrage with fairly good tracking, so it can keep up with a lot of bosses and enemy movements that like dodge, sidestep, and move around a lot. It's not perfect, but it's very consistent, and I found it to be overall better for most fights than the black bow because of how consistent the arrows were. If you don't want to get the black bow in Lindell, then by all means you can skip it and get the bone bow in the DLC. Next we have Ansbach's bow. To get this bow, you need to go to the Shadow Keep of the DLC and basically get right up to before the Mesmer fight. There's a quest line you need to do within the keep for Ansbach involved getting the Ancient Scroll, talking to Freya, exhausting the dialogue, talking to Leda, then deciding who to side with, and then invade either Leda or Ansbach. Killing or helping him here will award you with this bow, so regardless of the outcome, you'll get his bow. This bow is the best bow in the game. Like the black bow, it's a long bow with the moveset of a short bow, but this bow is stronger and scales better than the black bow. On top of that, its unique Ashes of War fan shot fires a shotgun of arrows that is extremely strong. Now, small side tangent as I explain this Ashes of War. So this fan shot is technically bugged. Fan shot fires 8 arrows in an obvious fan spread. So you can shotgun an enemy with it, and you'd expect it to deal about 8 times damage if you land all the arrows on the target, which is pretty true. However, it's true because of its flawed design. See, it doesn't matter how many arrows you actually hit the target with, it's always going to deal the damage as if you landed all the arrows on the target anyway. So you can spread shot 3 or 4 enemies and they're all going to take the same huge hit. So while this says multiply your damage by 8, it's all 8 in every arrow, but it only registers 1 regardless. It's weird, and it looks like it works, but the big bad bug here is that when you apply buffs that increase your attack damage and stuff, such as like Adrenaline Vapors, Jerky, Incantations, Pyromancies, all this stuff that boosts your attack, they're applying to each of the arrows, and then because all the arrows are adding to all the arrows, you're effectively getting 8 times your damage boosts on this shot. So if you're going to shoot for 100 damage before, then you would expect fan shot to shoot for like 800 or 100 for each arrow. But if you buff yourself, let's say with 50% more damage, you think your fan shot would hit for 1200, but know that 50% buff is added to each of the arrows, so you're actually getting like a 400% buff, and you'd hit for like 3200 damage instead. Stacking buffs onto this Ashes of War is kind of broken, so I didn't play with it that way, but it is an option if you want, and this thing can hit really flipping hard, way too hard. But I do expect this bug to get fixed, so be aware of that. It's not going to last forever, but it is pretty strong right now. But even when it does get fixed, it's still going to be insanely strong. It's a really good Ashes of War. Alright, back to what we were talking about. Ansbach bow is still best in slot regardless of bugged ashes or not. But then we got the last bow, Igon's GreatBow. This is easy to obtain, as you can do Igon's questline to completion once you encounter him and just, tread up the peak. You have to summon him for the Bale fight, which will reward you with this bow. This GreatBow is fantastic, by the way. There's nothing special about it compared to other GreatBows, but it does have a very strong Ashes of War that will let you scream at enemies before letting loose the arrow. But more importantly, that arrow is just going to do insanely high damage. I've hit this thing for like 8k on headshots before. It's stronger when you pair it with the special arrows that go with this bow, like Igon's harpoons. And like Radon's spears, they can also be infinitely bought, which makes it a great bow for sniping enemies in the game. I love having this in my secondary slot to pick off stronger enemies from afar. So yes, all 3 DLC weapons are pretty much the new best in slot for their class. So get them and forsake all the pre-DLC weapons. But if you're going to get the pre-DLC stuff, then I recommend the composite bow, the black bow, then you can throw out the composite bow, and just the standard GreatBow. Now regarding the crossbows, I don't personally like the crossbows all that much, but they do have their uses. In base game, the pulley crossbow is the only one that you really need. You can pick it up from the craftsman's shack at your leisure. I use it to spread statuses like bleed, freeze, and poison, and rot. While being able to fire 3 bolts at a time is great, it does become outclassed in DLC. Very early on, you can actually go into the DLC and just cross the Great Bridge at the beginning of the DLC and head down to the hill on the right to obtain the spread crossbow. This is the best and worst crossbow. It's the best because you can straight up shotgun enemies with 10 bolts per shot with the same loading and firing animation as a standard crossbow, so it does shoot faster than a pulley crossbow. And the bad thing is that, well, it consumes 10 bolts per shot, so you actually don't get very many shots in, though it is still great for applying statuses to bosses. And the other bad side is that it actually doesn't shotgun as well as you think. So while you can point blank enemies with this crossbow, there are hit limits, and I believe it's like 4 or maybe 5 are the maximum amount of hits you can actually apply. So you don't get to apply poison on like one volley of these bolts, sadly. This means that you're actually wasting a lot of bolts. It's still better than the pulley if you can craft all the bolts, but it's not as good as you think. I still use it for backup and to save arrows though. I do like having it just on my offhand for boss fights, so if I just need to apply a quick rot. Now, great crossbows and ballista, I'm kind of indifferent on. I find that great bows are better, they scale better, they have actual Ashes of War to use, and can be used faster. But of course, for PvP, you can't really beat sniping players with explosive bolts from across the map, and to make that better, the new magic jar cannon has tracking bolts, which are great. Though you do need to be locking on for those to be effective, which is a lot closer than people usually use this for. It's fun, but the split magic and physical damage means generally it's going to be weaker than the normal jar cannon, and the explosive bolts that pair with that on pretty much all the enemies. So I mean, they're cool, I just don't really use the big cannons unfortunately. Feel free to, of course, just mind your weight because they're really heavy and they do require a lot of strength. Now unfortunately, we're nowhere near done talking about equipment. That was just the general bows and crossbows. Do with that information what you will. But let's go ahead and talk about the actual arrows and bolts, because they do have some notes here. And look, there's a lot of arrows and bolts out there, too many in fact, because a lot of these aren't farmable to have like a reusable stock, or some of them just aren't worth using, main point being elemental arrows and bolts. And in case you didn't know, split damage is never great in Souls games. Having damage get cut down by multiple defenses always hurts, and for the most part, since you can't change the affinities of bows, pretty much most of your damage is going to be physical anyways, so adding just a little bit of elemental damage isn't really doing much for you, even if the target is weak to that element. This includes things like magic arrows and bolts, lightning arrows and bolts, holy arrows and bolts. Fire is actually not that bad. A lot of unarmored enemies and beasts tend to writhe in agony when set on fire. This is most notable against like the finger enemies, which are pretty much the only reason why I keep fire arrows around. Otherwise though, elemental arrows are pretty bad, because for the most part the standard base arrow is going to do more damage per hit anyway. Status arrows and bolts on the other hand are pretty good. I'm not going to say they're the best, but they're really good. See, the best arrows are the Stormwing arrows, and you're going to deal the most total damage with these than you would with something like a bleed, poison, or freeze, including their status damage, because the base damage is so low by comparison, and Stormwing just hits a lot harder. By the time you actually finish your status and get your proc, you probably could have done more damage with more storming arrows. But those arrows are annoying to farm and manage, so you're not always going to have those available to you. In that case, bleed, freeze, and rot arrows are your next best bet, and they can be farmed pretty easily. Farming flight pinions is just annoying in general, and you're going to have to do it for most of your arrows, but the DLC did add a nice area to farm them if you have a big AoE spell. Just go to the Grace by the Putrescence Knight and then murder all the animals and reset. And you just sit there and farm flight pinions and small beast bones all day. But fret not, if farming and crafting isn't your thing, you honestly can just stick to just buying the standard arrows, which most vendors have an infinite supply of. These deal 45 base damage compared to like Stormwing's 52, so they're not that much weaker, and they are still comparable to status arrows in general. Stormwing arrows also have a ton more stagger value compared to your standard arrow. They have 5 instead of 2, so you can get posture breaks with it, but honestly, that doesn't do much for bows, and most bosses, especially here in the DLC, can't really get posture broken by bows anyways, though you can on some bosses in the base game. But in general, you're going to want bleed arrows, and you can get the blood roses that you need to craft them infinitely by either talking to the merchant that's near Moog, or kill him and get the bell bearing and turn it in, and then you can buy pretty much everything you need to get infinite of your bleed arrows. Your frost arrows are also good on some select bosses like Melania, and you can farm these really easily. There is a gray spot that you can actually just collect like 15 or 16 of them and then reset, and it's just this little like ice plant thing, and do that, and then you can get a stockpile of those. And then the rot arrows, you have to get the Scarlet Iona butterflies, and then those are a little bit more annoying to farm, but you don't need a ton of them. But you can get a healthy supply of these if you need to, and just use them on bosses, and then for most normal adds, just stick to your standard arrows. So in summary, you're going to want to have the standard arrows. You can buy them infinitely, you're always going to have those on hand. If you want storming arrows, you're going to have to farm those a lot, or just mule them in, do what you got to do, but storming arrows are technically better. Bleed, freeze, and rot arrows are also farmable and usable in certain situations, and so I usually like to keep those on hand as well. But that's pretty much it. You don't really have to go out of your way to get anything else. You can if you want, but not really required. Same rules apply to bolts as well. For great arrows, you can just mass buy Rodon spears or Igon's harpoons, and I just pretty much use those exclusively. The DLC also added a few new arrows and bolts, the main ones being the peak bone arrows, which act like alluring skulls, allowing you to shoot areas to attract enemies. This is fun and useful to bait enemies around and arrow rain groups in, but honestly, I don't really like using them all that much. I don't like farming those materials either, so you can make it if you want to, but you don't have to. Okay, that's a lot. Let's move on to the other fun equipment though, the talismans. I'm going to discuss what's relevant to the bow build here. First, we have the 2 base game bow talismans, Arrow's Reach and Arrow's Sting talismans for range damage. You can grab both of these super early on in just a few towers, just head out there and just grab those and get those ASAP. Another early talisman that people usually get, the Claw talisman, which increases your jump attack damage. Cool, but unfortunately this doesn't apply to bows despite that we're going to be jump attacking a lot. There are a lot of items that you think would work for bows, but they don't, because FromSoft really doesn't care about bow gameplay all that much. Next though, Shard of Alexander, or the Warrior Jar Shard if you don't have that quest line done just yet. This affects your Ash of War damage, and we will be using our Ashes of War all the time, especially the Barrage, so this is a really good pick as well. I highly recommend it. And then of course you have your other generic increases for damage, such as the Blue Dancer Charm if you're going to go naked, Ritual Sword Talisman if you want to stay on full HP and pair it with Blue Dancer Charm, Red Feather Branch Sword if you want to be on low HP, stuff like that. You can just, any of those generic attack buffs will work for bows. Now, the talismans, and by extension the armor pieces that boost attacks, when there's poison, bleed, or madness nearby, seem like a great idea on paper, but it's not ideal for the bow playstyle. Like, you can use them all for sure, but the activation range on all of these is extremely small. Like, it's basically melee range. So if you're using like bleed arrows and the white mask, plus like Lord of Blood's exaltation, you won't get the buffs if you trigger the bleed on enemies, that's more than a few feet away from you, to be honest. Now, if you want to min-max and use the Seppuku art and then other self-inflicting statuses to trigger these, go for it. But if you're just equipping them on a pretty casual bow build, you probably won't trigger them all that much, so just be careful with that. In the DLC though, we did get blessed with some other good talismans. The new bow talisman, the Soaring Sting talisman, is both a damage and a range talisman. It does stack with the base game Arrow Sting talisman, so you get 2 of these together to get an 18% damage boost, which is pretty good. We also get the Sharpshooter Talisman, which is a 12% multiplicative damage boost, but only if you're in precision aiming mode, which is where you aim down sights in that little first-person reticle thing. I don't particularly like using this on bosses, since it's not very good on them. I mean, how often are you going to be in precision mode in a boss fight? But it is great for clearing through zones and sniping enemies. And just to note, no, the two-handed weapon talisman does not work for bows either, for whatever reason. I guess they don't count as two-handed weapons. Also, the retaliatory cross tree talisman doesn't work with bows either, so you can't roll and shoot for bonus damage, sadly. I know, shame, but we did get 2 good talismans to use. So I'd recommend normally to run the Sting and the Soaring Sting talisman pretty much all the time, as well as Shard of Alexander. Sharpshooter for non-bosses, and then you can either run Ritual Sword Talisman, Blue Dancer, or an Exaltation Talisman if you're feeling like you can get those in close range. You can also, of course, run a more defensive talisman setup, like I often run the Great Jars Arsenal for increased weight so I can use more armor and still stay on lightweight, and of course you could just go big mitigation talismans too. Whatever you'd want, at least I'd keep the 2 range damage talismans. Okay, almost done. Regarding armors, there aren't very many armors that buff bows directly, but there are some good choices for armors. I personally like to stay in lightweight, so that kind of limits my armor choice. But the first thing I gotta talk about is the black feather chest for the increased jump attacks. Again, ignore that since it does not work with bows. I know it's a great chest piece, doesn't work for us though. I like the black knife chest for the muffled sound, very good for stealthy shooting and clearing out areas without getting noticed. White mask and mushroom crowns are good if you pay attention to your status applications, but the Okina mask for 3 decks is a good option as well. In the DLC, we did get a ton of great armors, like the whole Rakshasa set for 2% damage on each piece, so that's 8%, but do be warned that the defensive values in this set are very bad for its weight, and will most likely get you put into medium weight as well. While the description does say that you're going to take increased damage when it's equipped, really it's just because of the low defensive values of the armor itself, not any other hidden penalty. You can also run the Fire Knight Helm for some general HP stamina weight increase, or the Divine Beast Helms for 4 strength and 4 dex at the cost of reduced flask healing. 8 stats in a headpiece slot is pretty flippin' good. Speaking of stats, let's talk about what you need. So you might be thinking, oh, it's a bow build, it's a dex build, stack dex. Well, you're wrong, sit down. Most bows in Elden Ring actually scale off both dex and strength. And while you do want dex, especially because Ansbach bow requires 43 dex, strength is still very important because of soft caps. You don't need a ton of strength, but you're going to want some if you want to use a GreatBow and a ballista as well. Also, don't skip out on the mind stat because you're going to be using a lot of Ashes of War with Barrage and Rain of Arrows and Radahn's Rain and stuff like that, so having good FP pool is very helpful. You can use equipment and talismans to boost your FP if you want, but I just put a few points into mind. Here's a reference for what stats feel good to me at level brackets 100, 150, and 200. Of course, these are just generalities, it's not min-maxed in any significant way, but this is just kind of like what I like and what I ran with. You're going to want some strength for scaling regardless, but having a near quality build also allows you a vast array of supporting weapons you could choose if you want to go that route with having something to like melee to back you up. Plus, you can take some off of mind or dex if you want to get a little bit more into int or faith or arcane, while still retaining most of your overall AP for a bow build. HP and stamina are more for your own comfort as well, but this is what felt good to me. Pretty much a quality build though. Alright, that should be pretty much everything that's exclusive to bow builds. As previously stated, you can definitely make this setup better if you use incantations or pyromancies for self buffs, sure, that's just not my style. But you do it if you want to. This is just a general framework and info for a pure bow gameplay setup and kind of like what you need. Once you're all good to go, just equip your bows, jump and shoot, roll and shoot more. I'd recommend spending a lot of your early game collecting all your bows and talismans, and again, see my old video if you want to check out where everything is on that. And try not to fret too much about arrow combines because standard arrows are still very solid and you're going to do just fine with those. Just spend your extra runes on stockpiling them. And when you can, make your way to Moat to get the blood roses for infinite buys to maintain your blood arrows, and you're pretty much good to go. Standard arrows and blood arrows, that's like 90% of your gameplay. I hope you enjoy the bow playstyle because FromSoft has never really intended for bows to be a main weapon and main source of damage, so you're going to be fighting with several systems against you, but I still enjoy it. Anyway, that's going to be all for me. Thank you all for watching. Good luck out there, hunters.